I know that for many, it may seem strange that the Catholic University of America cancels some classes on this day and rearranges others so that faculty and students can participate in this Mass honoring St. Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Dominican friar, a member of the Order of Preachers. It may seem strange that the National Catholic Educational Association would choose this Mass to celebrate the 40th anniversary of National Catholic Schools Week. For years, the Catholic University of America has invited the Dominican friars from our House of Studies across the street to participate in this Mass in a special way. We are, after all, the religious brothers of St. Thomas Aquinas. We know him well. And we know, as Dominican friars, why St. Thomas is so important to us and to the Church. But we often have to admit, sometimes begrudgingly, that it is not manifestly clear why he is the patron of schools, or why he is the patron of universities, of teachers, of students. It's not self-evident to many that this friar who died 740 years ago is worthy of the attention he is receiving today in this beautiful basilica. As a student, St. Thomas was shy and bashful. He rarely spoke up in class. He was the sort of student that others would either mock or pity. We know of one student who took pity on him to help him with his logic homework, but came to a problem that he himself couldn't solve, and then St. Thomas, with his characteristic humility and with a great deal of embarrassment, then shows his Good Samaritan tutor how to work through the problem. Fortunately, St. Thomas had one of those unique teachers in St. Albert the Great who saw in him real talent and real gifts, real genius, a gift from God. A teacher who knew that this student, for all his bashfulness and humility, would teach one day so that the whole world would hear. I dare say each of us has had a teacher like that in our lives who saw something in us nobody else did. Thank God for St. Albert the Great. Today, few who know St. Thomas's life and his accomplishments would doubt that he was indeed a great teacher and preacher. He was a man who didn't simply spout facts and doctrines. This would not make him either a great teacher or a great preacher. Rather, he was a man who helped his students to grow in understanding and to grow in true wisdom. He had the enviable ability to hear arguments and disputes, especially from his students, that he knew were wrong and were contrary to the truth, that he knew went against his own teaching and what he had just taught them. He had the ability to help his students make their arguments better. He could listen to them and help them understand their own thoughts and their own position, help them to see the ramifications of what they were saying, and then he would slowly lead them to the truth. He was supremely confident in the power of truth because he believed, he knew that there is such a thing as truth. And we're all looking for it, no matter what we believe or what we study. Seeking truth was the guiding principle of his life, and when he found it, wherever he found it, he wanted to share it with his students, he wanted to share it with the world. He was a great teacher, and a very prolific one at that. Just to give you an example, Toward the end of his life, during a 3-year stint at the University of Paris, he wrote the central and largest part of his massive work, the Summa Theologiae, a couple thousand questions, all answered very thoroughly. Thousands and thousands of words, page after page. But not only that, in those 3 years, he wrote commentaries on virtually every work of Aristotle, commentaries on the book of Job, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, and virtually every letter of St. Paul in the New Testament. He wrote an entire treatise on evil in the world and on virtue, among other things. There's more. In 3 years, before there were word processors, or typewriters, or even a printing press. I challenge colleagues to surpass that publishing record. Tenure, anyone? Indeed, it was a superhuman feat. No doubt evidence of the graced charism this doctor had. As his reputation grew and his teaching circulated, he found himself in trouble with certain church authorities. He was, to put it colloquially, a radical liberal for his day, a Christian dialoguing with Muslims and unbelievers, and engaging the work of the Greek pagan philosopher Aristotle to do so. After he died at the age of 49, some of his teachings were condemned, wrongly, it later turned out. And he had no student, no disciple who could rise to defend him, who could hold even a candle to his intellectual caliber. It was finally, once again, his teacher, now the elderly St. Albert the Great, in the last years of his life, who rallied to the defense of his great student. Once again, thank God for St. Albert the Great. Thank God for teachers. When he was finally canonized, almost 50 years after his death, he became, many have noted, the first saint to be canonized not because he was a martyr or because he made some great gesture of evangelical zeal, or because he had been a bishop, a position he was offered but declined, or because he was a great monk, another lifestyle he declined to the consternation of his family who imprisoned him for it. Rather, he was the first to be canonized because he was a great teacher and a great preacher. And you might think that that would be enough, that we gather here to honor the great teacher and theologian saint, to ask for his intercession because he was so accomplished, so prolific, such a wonderful teacher and thinker, that this is why he is the patron saint of this university, of schools, of teachers and students. You might think that, but you'd be wrong. It's not because of St. Thomas's accomplishments, many though they are, that the church canonized him and declared him the common doctor, teacher of the church, and even today prizes his thought, his theology, above all others. He who at the end of his life saw all of his writings and all of his work as so much straw compared to the immense beauty of God would revolt at such a suggestion. No, St. Thomas should hold a special place in every educator's heart, in every student's heart, because of what he believed about learning and about the pursuit of knowledge and truth, regardless of field or discipline. St. Thomas insisted that we become what we know. We are configured to the things we study. A person who studies biology becomes a biologist in some way, even if only slightly and reluctantly in freshman biology. But the person who loves to study biology sees her love for it grow as her knowledge of it grows. And she becomes a biologist not only in name, but also in character. We can say biology pleases her. We are creatures marked by a desire to know and to learn, not just in the classroom, but in the chapel, at home, on the street, through the things we read and see on television and the internet. We're always soaking up knowledge. We're always growing and knowing more and more. Some of it helps us become better persons. Some of it can degrade us. Some of it seems useless. But we're always learning. Whether it's how to drive a car, how to fix a car, how cellular mitochondria works, the beauty of poetry written in iambic pentameter, pursuing the higher philosophical truths about the world and life, to studying God's own self-revelation to us. We're made to know and to seek truth. And St. Thomas would dismiss with prejudice any idea that we learn simply because it's useful. He would be saddened to see any of us stop and rest with studying only the most practical and pragmatic of things, learning simply to get the degree, simply to get the job, the house, the car, all good things. St. Thomas argues that knowledge and its pursuit for its own sake is the most important because it leads us closer to truth. And truth is real. It can be found. It wants to be found. It calls to us, waiting to be found. And truth is more than quantity and measurement. It's more than feeling and opinion. It's more than even beauty. We're made to look for it, to seek it everywhere and always, restlessly devouring knowledge on our way. And St. Thomas believed this for one single reason. God is truth. Truth, it turns out, is a person, a divine person. And we were made for him, to seek him. And he wants to be found. So much so that he reveals himself in the wonder of his creation, in the beauty of his creatures, in the accomplishments of reason, and in the best this world has to offer. It's precisely because this person, this truth itself comes to us in Jesus Christ, that St. Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic tradition with him can boldly accept the true conclusions and the good insights of all the sciences and disciplines that make up any great university. It's precisely because God touched our world as man, experienced our life, was born, grew, learned, suffered, and died like us, that studying even the smallest grubworm can now be an avenue to discerning the beauty and the truth of God. St. Thomas was certainly not the first to articulate this truth, and he's definitely not the last, but he taught it and he preached it in the very way he lived, day in and day out. He was looking to know truth because he was looking to know God, and he found ways to know God, even in reading Aristotle. But where he was most at home, where he truly felt close to God, was in his prayer and reading the sacred scripture. His work is permeated with a profound familiarity with the sacred words of the Bible. It's a familiarity that comes not from pure academic study of a text, but from a deep, abiding friendship with Jesus Christ. A friendship that can only flourish if a person is spending time with the Lord in prayer, in his presence, and with his word. And that's why this saint, this intellectual giant, his teachings and principles enduring to this day, That's why he was always known for being an incredibly humble man. Knowledge may be power, but the more St. Thomas knew about the world and about God, the more he knew about himself and about our sinful human condition, the more he grew in humility. He was never a man who would beat up his opponents in debates simply to demonstrate his prowess. He never used his knowledge and his study for personal gain. He embodied what is often said about our Holy Father, St. Dominic. He was always talking about God or to God. This is what St. Thomas came to know in his life and passes on to us today. It's the truth of the gospel. God desires to give to us whatever we ask, precisely because we love his Son, so that our joy may be full. God wants to be known. He wants to be loved. He wants to love. In the end, all of our learning, all of our pursuits must yield to this pearl of wisdom. We need only to ask, to be humble, and to ask God for our happiness and our joy, to ask him for our success, to ask him to bring us closer. If learning and study swells up our pride such that we feel no need in asking, then we can be sure it has been all for naught and will never truly be happy or truly joyful. The more a person of learning excels, the more he should know of his insufficiency, his poverty before the great truths of the universe, the great truth of God. Humility, Aquinas once said, is what renders us capable of God to begin with. It is a most necessary virtue to bring us closer to the Lord, because without it, we attempt our lives and to live our lives on our own, at best. And at worst, we attempt to reach him without his help, which is both frustrating and impossible. Only humility asks God, show me, bring me closer. And the good news is he will do it. In St. Thomas's view, humility gives us untrammeled access to God's spiritual and divine goods, precisely because we need humility to ask for what God so desires to give. In the end, that's the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas. In the end, that's why he's the patron of education. By God's grace, this is the wisdom that every student will come to know, that every great teacher hopes to impart, and that every saint lives. So through the intercession of St. Thomas Aquinas, may our studies bring us closer to God by bringing us deeper humility, so that we might receive the abundant joy that God has always wanted to give.